that somebody enjoyed, no matter the pleasures that somebody enjoyed, at the end of it, everybody dies. So is there anything of lasting value? Is it worth expending all of the energy that we have just to get to the point of dying, and then it's all over? Arthur Brooks recently wrote an article. I haven't read the whole thing. The first part begins, though, with his story about being on an airplane, and he hears somebody behind him speaking. It's an elderly gentleman, and he says to his wife, he's kind of down about this, and he says, "I wish I were dead." And he begins wondering about this. Wondering about the person who might articulate this. What is it that leads a person to say this in old age? And much to his surprise, when they got off the airplane, this was a very famous person. This was somebody who had accomplished much. This is somebody whom people held in high esteem, in high honor, who had served the country, who was well respected. It was this person who in his older age said, "I wish I were dead." Is it because there's something about this sentiment from Ecclesiastes that gets all of our attention? If in the end we all die anyway, then what's the point? What have I accomplished? What good does it do? It's almost a despair of Ecclesiastes. And in some ways, it seems to have found its way into the lives of the Corinthians, because when they hear about the resurrection of the body and what Paul has to say, they say it more like this: "I believe the resurrection of the body? Come on, Paul. You don't actually mean that." When they heard Paul speaking about the resurrection of the body, they certainly did not think that it had anything to do with these flesh and blood bodies of ours that will one day be raised to life. No, Paul. That's not what you mean. The Corinthians thought it must have been something else. They couldn't quite grasp this. Maybe they didn't want to grasp this. Maybe they had become so frustrated in their own bodies, not even thinking about the possibility that this could happen, but the frustration and the embarrassments of our bodies at times, that they just wanted to kind of rid themselves of these bodies at some point. Then we will truly live. We know the aches, we know the pains, we know the discomforts that we feel, the frustrations of not being able to do what we want when we want because our bodies simply just won't allow us to. The Corinthians seem to live with a sense that if they could just be freed from these bodies, then they would truly live. When will that happen? Then we'll find fulfillment. And Paul says to this, no. And he says it very forcefully and very insistently. And he says it because in Paul's understanding, as we've come to learn, death isn't something that's simply the last event of a life naturally lived. It's not just the end of the timeline, what's supposed to happen. Paul understands that death is an enemy. That's what he writes about earlier in the chapter. Death is an enemy. It's the last enemy, and it's going to be destroyed. Meaning that for Paul, as he's responding to the Corinthians, what Paul is trying to insist upon, I think, is a very, very basic question. In whom do you trust? What do you trust? What has final say? Is it the degrading power of death? Or is it the Creator God who gives life and defends life, redeems life, recreates life, so that in the end it will be as it was in the very beginning? In Paul's mind, in Paul's understanding, this is not simply a theoretical question. Paul understands this to have day-to-day consequences because on the one hand, if people would simply assume that the resurrection of the body cannot happen, that death has final say, then it becomes very natural, in a sense, to not take anything of created life all that seriously. So the environment or other person's bodies or even our own bodies, if it's just going to die, if it just goes away, then why bother taking so much care of it? And yet, on the other hand, if God is the author of life, if God's the sustainer, if God is the renewer of life, then it naturally follows that everything of created life takes on heightened importance, and we pay careful attention to it, and we defend it. The environment, other person's bodies, our own bodies, because God created it, and God created it good, and God is doing a new work to restore it all. Well, the Corinthians still aren't sure, so you heard them at the beginning of our passage today. They're skeptical. They've got these questions. Okay, Paul, this is what you say, but how are the dead raised? And with what kind of bodies will they come? See, Paul, you don't get this. You've seen these bodies of ours. You see what happens to them. They go into the ground. That's what happens. Paul, how are they going to be raised? Well, what kind of bodies will be raised? Paul, you don't have any answers for this. And Paul responds in two ways. The first, he's very, very blunt with the Corinthians. He says, how foolish. That's not a compliment. That's not just a throwaway. The foolish are those who do not know God. The foolish are those who do not take into consideration the power of God and God's intentions for this world and what God is able to do given his power and his purposes and his promises. The Corinthians are completely oblivious to this in Paul's mind. You don't think that there can be the resurrection of the body? You haven't considered God, and you might want to consider God. But the second thing Paul does is really a gracious thing, and I think a really pastoral thing, in that he presents before us a couple of observable facts about creation. And he begins to open our minds anew to ponder the possibilities of what God can do given God's creative power. So he talks about seeds. I brought some seeds with me. If you would look at these, you can't even see them, right? I'll toss them, see if you can see them. Yeah, they're pretty small. What do you think would become of this seed? You'd look at this and you'd say, This is what Paul is talking about. Here's these seeds. Try it again. You can hardly see them. This is what they'll turn into. Wait for it. Now, isn't that something? This is what Paul's talking about. Seeds, you observe this. You've seen it happen. You plant a seed in the ground and wait for it, and something spectacular begins to grow. And in short order, it astounds you with the beauty that results. Now imagine that. Your bodies, they're sown, they die. But wait for it. These bodies that are sown perishable, they're raised imperishable. These bodies that are sown in dishonor, they're raised in glory. These bodies that are sown in weakness, they're raised with power. You've seen it with these seeds. It's kind of like that. This is the power of the Creator God to take what is weak and perishable and yet from that bring about something wondrous that will astound you. This is what God does. Paul then speaks of splendors. There's different kinds of splendors. You heard him say it. There's earthly splendors and heavenly splendors, all related to bodies. His point being that God creates and he gives each body a splendor and he adapts it for the appropriate environment. So the moon has its own splendor in the heavens, and it's perfectly situated for the heavens. I hate snakes, but snakes have been given their own splendor, and they're perfectly situated for the habitat that God has given it. Now think about your bodies. Think about how you've been created with a splendor and you're perfectly situated for the environment that God has placed you in. You go outside and you breathe the air and you can soak in the sun and you can work the soil. Isn't that something? This splendor that God has given you in your body, perfectly situated for the environment in which you find yourself. Now hold on, because this is where Paul really begins to get our attention. These bodies that we live in now, even with their own splendor, are going to be the bodies that are buried. But they will be raised, and then they will be given a new splendor for a new environment. This new environment, not just earth as we know it, but the new creation, the renewed earth, when heaven and earth are joined and God's presence and power fill it all in such a way that death simply cannot be present. Jesus' body, raised from the dead. And you see what happens. They're locked in a room. Nobody can get in or out. And there's Jesus. Well, how did that happen? I don't know, but he's in a new body. It's as physical and it's as tangible as our bodies, but it's the new body. It's the body that was sown, a natural body, but raised a spiritual body, and perfectly situated now, perfectly adapted for God's new creation, that creation for which we await. Paul says, this is what will happen to your bodies. Because the Creator God, who created all things good, our bodies included, has not completed his work. There's a final chapter when all things are made new, and your bodies and my body will either be raised or transformed in an instant such that they are perfectly situated for that new environment that we can only hope for and long for in the moment. And as astounding as that all sounds, Paul basically says, so it will be, and it can't be otherwise. Because at one point we belonged to the first man, the natural man, Adam. But now we belong to the second man, Jesus, the one from heaven, the life-giving Spirit. As in Adam all die, but so in Christ all shall be made alive. How can we see this? How can we believe this? I believe the resurrection of the body. What we see doesn't make this plain to us. What we experience doesn't make this plain to us. And yet Paul says this is what God has said. This is what God has done. And because God has done this to Jesus Christ, since you belong to him, it's inevitable for you. So he says three things. First, surprisingly, a very aggressive taunt. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? You're powerful. You have done terrible things. You have saddened me. You have made me cry out. You have made me call out. But where's your victory? Yeah. Because through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, God has defeated death. And death can seek to do its worst, and it can't win. So second, Paul says, thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. This terrible power that destroys and deteriorates and diminishes, it's been defeated, and it's soon to be destroyed. And so third, Paul says, therefore, brothers and sisters, my dear brothers and sisters, as hard as it might be to believe this because we simply cannot see it, Paul says, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord. Give yourselves fully to this gospel that we have heard and received. Live fully in light of it, knowing that your labor, that your service to the Lord is not, and you heard it right, it's not in vain. What was the preacher in Ecclesiastes so stumped by? The vanity. Everything seems to be in vain because at the end of the day, everybody dies, and what's the point? And Paul says, your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Because it's the Creator God who brought Jesus Christ into this world, and after he was crucified, it's the Creator God who raised Jesus to life, and it's this one who will come back, and when he does, usher us in to that new creation. So what does the therefore look like very briefly? First, this confirms our best intentions. We've thought about this, talked about this before. There's some moments of life that are so good and so beautiful, they bring tears to your eyes because you can't believe how joyful this is. Paul's saying, trust that intuition. Trust it. When you see the sunrise, when you hold the baby, when you experience a meal with your family and friends, and it's just as it ought to be, Paul says, yes. That's God's intention. That's why God created life, for this. And God defends that and will bring us to the day when that is all we know. So secondly, this gospel then, what he wants the Corinthians to know and for us to know, it drives away despair. Despair sometimes is taken to be the notion that nothing good can be possible, nothing good can happen. Maybe that's partially true. Maybe it's also helpful to think about despair in the sense of longing for something really good, but not being able to see how that could possibly be brought about given the current conditions. In despair saying, I can't handle the thought of something so good, but never obtaining it. That's despair. Here's what Paul holds before us. On the one hand, the reality of death and how awful it is in all of its forms, and yet the confident hope that God will bring about something so wondrous we can't hardly begin to fathom it in the present. And because of that, despair has no place. What can we see? What do we experience? It tells us one thing. Paul says, don't trust that. Trust the Creator God, who in the very beginning said it's very good and is determined to bring about that very goodness in the end forever. Third, then, our actions. What does this look like? The Corinthians are kind of a funny bunch. Paul takes them to task on any number of things. We might summarize them in a couple of ways, and this is what sin does. Sin abuses because it tries to take for itself and claim for itself that which is not its right. But I need to take what I can to enjoy what I can now. That's abuse. Neglect is saying that person, that environment, that whatever doesn't matter. It's not my responsibility, so I'm going to ignore it. The Corinthians, if you read through this letter, they evidence both dimensions of this, and Paul calls them away from both, and he calls them to a place of settledness of love. Confidence in the fact that God is good, and God is faithful to his purposes, so we live in light of that, tending for one another, tending for the environments around us, confident that God will come to our aid in the present, and confident that in the end, God will make it all new again. So live lives that exhibit it. Meaning that fourth, this gospel, the resurrection of the body, it encourages our hopeful witness. What do we say? Well, we say these words every time we're in a cemetery, don't we? At a grave site, where it looks like the end, it looks so final, what can happen? We say the words we heard this morning. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? We're here, it looks final, it isn't. How many people need to hear that? A lot of us, and a lot of our neighbors, need to know that though death is strong, it doesn't have the final say. And then our witness indeed. Tim and I stopped by Carolyn Boer this week. We walk into her room and she's doing what she's often doing. She's knitting. Because she can and because she wants to. Because people give her yarn and she turns it into hats and blankets for people that need them. And she does it because she knows that this is how she's called to love. And even though it feels like her life is limited, and even though she can't do as much as she used to, or maybe even as much as she wants to, she gives herself to this. Because it's how she can show her love. And these actions testify to the fact that there's a whole lot more coming. And so she gives herself fully into the present to serve those that she can. That's what hopeful witness looks like. How do we do it? How will you do it in this week, in your speech, in your actions, as a way of demonstrating to a watching world that death is terrible, and it seeks to diminish and to destroy, but the God to whom we belong through Jesus Christ has overcome the grave, and one day will destroy death forever, such that we will only live with lasting joy. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven,